Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm stepping in for George Richards this morning. Unfortunately, he's been called away for a family emergency, but do stay with us today. It's going to be a recorded session with Q&A at the end. We've got some really good speakers for you this morning. My name is Carol Somper, Director of Sustainability at JRP Solutions. So let's get going. Right, so just a few brief words about JRP. Established in 1999, we've been going for about 20 years. We're the UK's leading independent energy and net zero specialists. We're independent of any particular technology, so we give practical, objective advice. We're working across a lot of different sectors, including food and drink, telecommunications, higher education and manufacturing. So we have a lot of experience, and we're working with a lot of clients now to look at practical net zero strategies. And as a consultancy, we're certificated to ISO 9001, 50001, and we have our own 2030 net zero target, and we're just awaiting confirmation that we've become a B Corp business. So our programme today is going to look at setting out an emissions system boundary and inventory in quite a high level way, the pros and cons, the things to be aware of, what's good practice, issues to get to grips with. We're not going to go into a lot of detail about the technicalities of it, because there are some excellent standards and guidance out there from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a carbon inventory is. Then we're going to hand over to Sonia Bonsall at Carbon Disclosure Project. I'll then explain a bit about the relationship between science-based targets and carbon inventory. And then we've got 3 examples of what's being done by organisations in different sectors. Then we'll have a recap at the end, and we're going to finish with a Q&A session. So please, as we go through, post your questions onto the chat and we'll pick those up at the end. We'll only be able to take a few, but we will respond to all of them. So we will get back to you, as well as the recording of the session. There'll be a complete set of responses to any questions that we've posed. So what is a carbon inventory? There are several greenhouse gases. The 6 main greenhouse, or the main greenhouse gases are listed there. The emissions that are given in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents to cover that basket of greenhouse gases, and some are much more potent than others. They have different global warming potentials. So if carbon dioxide is 1, methane is over 20, and something like sulfur hexafluoride is nearly 23,000 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So why do we measure them as carbon dioxide? Because it's the most persistent in the atmosphere, and it's the most voluminous in terms of quantity. So those are the global warming potentials listed there. And if you're involved in anything with a high level of refrigerants, air conditioning, then sulfur hexafluoride particularly is going to be an issue. And obviously different sectors give rise to different amounts of emissions. Energy sector is obviously one of the biggest, and fossil fuel industry particularly. Manufacturing and heavy industry is another one. Agriculture is often given as an important source of carbon dioxide emissions, of carbon dioxide equivalents, particularly from fertiliser, nitrous oxide. Methane is particularly important. So all of the sectors have different types of sources of emissions and prevalence of emissions. So depending on which sector you're in, you obviously need to address your emissions inventory accordingly. And this is a fantastic illustration from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, illustrating the different sources of emissions in terms of scopes, the three main scopes, one obviously being direct combustion on site. Scope 2 is primarily through the generation of electricity, so that's combustion off-site, and then Scope 3, upstream and downstream, covers all of the other sources of emissions. A lot of organisations are focusing on Scopes 1 and 2 within their immediate operative boundary, but Scope 3 is really important. There are 15 categories of Scope 3, with the supply chain being the biggest, and if you ignore that, then you're ignoring a big source of emissions and possibly not making decisions in the best way that you could. So you must account for the whole iceberg, not just the tip. I'm going to hand over now to Sonia Bonsall, who's Global Head of Value at the Carbon Disclosure Project, and she's going to set the scene for us and tell us what's happening on a global scale. Sonia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you for having me. So just to build on Carol's introduction, my name is Sonia Bonsley. I'm Global Head of Value Chains and Regional Director of Corporations at CDP. I'm going to be talking to you a bit about the importance of emissions reporting and building an emissions inventory. I'm going to hopefully tell this in a story that can really articulate the benefits of going through and creating emissions inventory for the first time, or even improving your emissions inventory. So just quickly, a little bit of an introduction to CDP. So why am I here? So for those of you who've not heard of us, and normally I do miss the days pre-COVID, I'd say show of hands who here has heard of CDP. I'm not going to put everyone through that now, but CDP is a global not-for-profit organisation that collects environmental information from thousands of companies around the world. We have the most comprehensive collection of self-reported data, and we pass this information to relevant interested parties. So I could, and I have in previous years, talked a bit about, when I was like the importance of reporting, talk a bit about the urgency around climate change. However, I think everyone on here knows about the urgency of climate change, but just to restate, the IPCC reports that for a 66% better chance of staying below a 1.5 degree of global warming, global emissions must reach a net zero by 2050 at the latest. So action on emissions is critical. And the world's responding to that via the school strikes, or is very much at the forefront of thinking. And so I'm not going to labour that point. I think we all know that point. What I'm going to do is talk about how different stakeholders have responded to that status and who will be asking about emissions inventories and the benefits of going through and collecting that data. So we go on to the next slide. So CDP is 20 years old. So we have 20 years of experience of companies reporting their emissions to us. The way it works is very simple. We were founded by the investor community 2 decades ago, who could see that climate change would represent a risk and an opportunity for companies in the future. They wanted to get a better handle of that. And at the time, there wasn't really a standardized way for them to collect data on what these companies were doing. They couldn't collect comparable climate change data sets, and that includes the emissions inventories. So we at the time worked with, I think it was 45 investors. We asked about 100 companies to disclose their climate information, of which a critical part was the emissions data set. I think we got a 60% response rate from those 100 companies, and that was deemed good enough by the investor community to carry on. And so we created an annual disclosure process alongside them, which very much mimicked the financial disclosure process, whereby companies would take stock of their emissions year on year and report them back to the investor community so they could better see progress, they could understand the emissions associated with the investments that they were having and make decisions based on this information. We go on to the next slide. And so I mentioned we work with 45 at the beginning. We now work with 590 investors that represent over $110 trillion in assets under management. We also work with over 200 supply chain large company purchasers, or large purchasers actually, they're not all companies, some of them are government organisations, who have a combined purchasing power of 5.5 trillion. And we've seen environmental and particularly emissions reporting come a little bit closer to business as normal. Nearly 10,000 companies reported their climate information through CDP last year. 812 cities disclosed their environmental information, and 131 states and regions. So the program itself, the concept of reporting your emissions publicly or through us, go stay on that last slide, we'll talk about how investors use the data in a second, has become very much embedded in the way that these organisations are working on an annual basis. And that reporting process, it lends benefits in and of itself. They find that you cannot manage what isn't measured, and measuring in and reporting in a standardized format actually helps companies take a better stock of their emissions, but then look at how they can reduce them in the future. So let's quickly dive into, next slide please, the investors, and are they using your data or using the data companies report? And particularly, are they using the emissions inventories that the companies are reporting? So the CDP data is utilised in a variety of different ways. It goes into research products and ratings such as Bloomberg, MSCI, ESG for any of the bigger companies out there. But they are, let's focus in on this emissions inventory. They are using the emissions that companies are reporting. So investors such as Schroders and CalPERS use CDP data to assess the carbon footprint of their portfolio. So they will look at their portfolio, what the emissions they're reporting, the companies are reporting, and build their own, as Carol talked about, their own Scope 3 report, their own Scope 3 inventory based on the emissions that the companies report to us. And that's really important, because I was on a panel last week with, I think it was actually Impact who put it best, who said, if you're creating your inventory and you're reporting it to us, then we understand what is really happening with you. If we don't, we're still going to make these decisions, but we're going to do it using model data that doesn't actually relate to any of the work that you're doing at the moment. So again, the importance of creating this inventory and reporting it enables you to tell your story to stakeholders such as the investors who will take action on this. If we go on to the next slide. So Schroders put it quite nicely. The argument that climate change can affect value is something that is, pretty much broadly accepted, but reporting data provides that bridge that enables them, investors, to actually understand what these companies are doing and to work with you on reducing emissions and make decisions based on it. Go on to the next slide. Now, the purchasing organisations, this is where I really wanted to focus a lot of what I wanted to talk to you about. Carol already talked to us a bit about the iceberg, the Scope 1 and 2. After investors have been asking companies to report to CDP for about a decade, we saw a global recognition that in climate change, impacts or risks and opportunities aren't limited to your own operations, and that actually emissions outside of your operations are even bigger and as material to a company's or to the company's operations. So if your suppliers, for instance, fail to deliver because of climate change, that has material impacts on your own business. So they started something called the supply chain program. And just to build a bit on that iceberg aspect, our data shows that upstream emissions are 11.4 times that of operational emissions on average. And if you look up going up to retailers, that can scale up to 24 times that. So the scope 3 emissions represent a really material part of an emissions inventory. And so from that decade, we started working with companies on engaging their suppliers to influence these emissions. And we now work with about 200 major purchasers who represent $5.5 trillion of spend. The likes of Walmart, we work with the NHS, Nissan, in the UK, Jaguar Land Rover, Vodafone, BT, Diageo. These sorts of companies are asking their suppliers to create an emissions inventory and to report it to them to help them create their own emissions inventory. And we surveyed them last year, and they said that 95% of them said that they are planning to use environmental metrics within their procurement practices in the future. And some purchasers like L'Oreal and Diageo have already started to integrate this data in supplier evaluations and performance reviews, and reporting scope 1 and 2 emissions, or reporting your own operational emissions, that's being integrated in. And Dell, who I work with very closely, couldn't have put it better on a webinar that I did with them years ago, when they said, when we want to collaborate with our suppliers, we want to see, work with you, but to do that, the first step we need to see from you is creating an emissions inventory so that we can better understand what you're doing and then work to influence that going forward. If you go on to the next slide. You'll actually find that reporting your emissions in a standardized format lends benefit to your own understanding of your emissions. Now, I've worked with Walmart for a decade, so I'm allowed to tell this story because I've seen them tell it in New York. They were asked to disclose to CDP by the investor community for 2 or 3 years, and they had declined to do so. We were a very small, not-for-profit company out of the UK, less than 10 members of staff, so they didn't really see much value. Then the investor pressure grew and grew to the point they said, actually, we're going to go through and do this. We know our emissions inventory. We understand. We have the largest trucking fleet in the world. Walmart is, for anyone who doesn't know them, they're one of the biggest retailers in America. They have a spend that is actually bigger than quite a lot of the GDP of European countries, so a massive organization. They said, we've got the largest trucking fleet in the world. That's where our emissions problems are. We're focusing our attention on this. They then disclosed to CDP using a standardized format, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, as Carol mentioned. And going through that standardized reporting format enabled them to highlighted an area of emissions they hadn't previously been monitoring and weren't taking much of an action on, which was HCFC refrigerant leakages. Now, that doesn't apply to everyone, but the story here, I think, does. Going through and creating a good emissions inventory can highlight aspects of your emissions that you previously hadn't really accounted for. And it was actually, I think it was their director of operations, he was on a panel in New York, who said it. If we'd have had refrigerant leakages legislated in any of the 54 countries that we operate in, that is a risk that we weren't ready for. We didn't know what our emissions, were on that front. So by going through this standardized format, we understood our emissions. We could start to take action to reduce those emissions. We also felt prepared for any changes in policy or stakeholder interest in our emissions inventory. So again, that just identifies, very nearly done, Carol, I can see that I'm probably at time, that just shows that going through this process really does help. You future-proof yourself for governmental changes, for investor changes, and also for customer interest changes. Go on to the next slide. And it also means that you're ready to respond. So if you do get a customer that's new, who then has integrated this sort of thing into their emissions inventory, you're ready to respond to that. I think that's my last slide. Go to the last one. Oh no, so the trend. Creating an emissions inventory isn't actually that unusual. Creating a good one isn't unusual either. We saw 9,600 companies report to CDP, of which over 90% could report their scope 1 and 2 emissions. It has become the business norm. And so I would, if you've never done it before, recommend that you get started to keep pace with other companies. And then finish on Christiana Figueres. Oh no, last one. This is what your this is what the stakeholders typically expect of you. So this is an amalgamation of 200 purchasers and those 510 investors. This is typically what we see them ask companies to do: disclose their information, calculate and report emissions, and then all the other KPIs build on that. So until you get a really good emissions inventory, you're not ready to really set a target to report to take action on it. You're not ready to set an SBT, which I think Carol and Tom are talking about a little bit later on. It really is step one of a climate journey with your stakeholders. And then I really will have Christiana Figueres' quote now. Undertaking an emissions inventory, quite simply, gives you is the future of business what the X-ray machine was then to the future of medicine. By taking a snapshot of your emissions, you understand where the problems lie so that you can take the action necessary to really meet that IPCC future. I'm going to stop there. I was a couple of minutes over. I apologize. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavour for why you should start to calculate and report your emissions and the benefits it would give you in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sonia. That's helped set up this morning really well. I'm going to talk a little bit about science-based targets, which Sonia's also already raised, because there's a lot of activity around this now. What is a science-based target? Science-based target and getting to net zero go hand in hand, and a science-based target is a means of getting to net zero. And the SBT initiative has one goal: it's to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. So the process is down at the bottom of the right hand of the screen. This is a partnership initiative undertaken with CDP, UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, who devised the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and have produced the various standards, and Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF. So the goal of setting a science-based target is to use evidence-based sectoral information from all of the data that's being collected, particularly by CDP, to limit global warming, and there are well-evidenced pathways. So you'll be benchmarking yourself within your sector. All sectors can set science-based targets at the moment, except oil and gas, because it's a bit more complicated. SBTi produced updated guidance and criteria on how to set a target this April, and there's 21 criteria altogether, and I've just pulled out some that refer to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Standard, which should be your Bible, and the relationship of setting an SBT to your carbon inventory and your emissions boundary. So criteria 2 covers materiality. If something is an emission source less than 5% of your scope 1 and 2 emissions, you don't have to include it in your boundary. All relevant greenhouse gases must be reported on, as I started off with today. So you report in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. It covers bioenergy accounting in your boundary, subsidiaries, and number 17, very important, referring back to scope 3 again. If your scope 3 emissions are more than 40% of your total annual footprint, you must include them in your science-based target. And that will cover virtually 90% of organisations out there, really. And Sonia also spoke very comprehensively about the importance of Scope 3 in the value chain. Criteria 18 covers boundary in particularly, and talks about the minimum boundary for each category. So I do commend to you reading the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate value chain reporting standard. It's quite a chunky document, but it's set out in user-friendly terms with lots of examples and helpful diagrams. So it should be a Bible for you. And the final criteria, number 21, again talks about sector-specific guidance. And this is a growing aspect around science-based targets, because going back to the beginning, we looked at the different sectors are responsible for producing different amounts of global emissions. So it's not fair to compare, have the same emissions reduction trajectory for an office-based organisation compared to a mining company. So SBTI have been working on a number of research projects with different partners around the world, and you can see down the right-hand side that different sectors have got a finalised sector guidance. Apparel and footwear, financial institutions were one of the first, power sector, really, really important, and also ICT. And the example graph on the left is taken from the ICT guidance, and you can see that this is just an example covering scopes 1 and 2. Data centres have a much bigger emissions footprint than fixed network operators. So if you're an ICT organisation like Vodafone, for example, you will be looking to set a different science-based target for each of those different subsectors within your business. And it means that you can be much more focused and effective in setting your reductions pathway. So SBTs are a tool for achieving net zero. You need to use your emissions inventory to identify where the biggest sources of emissions are, what needs to take priorities, where you can achieve quick wins, where you may need to take a longer term strategy, and particularly in the much longer term, have something in your reduction strategy when you can take advantage of changes in technology, where you need to be aware and plan for changes in regulations. So, you know, automotive industry after a certain date, new petrol and diesel vehicles won't be produced, and so it's taking a notice of those milestones that you need to be aware of. SBTs aren't yet mandatory, but they are designed to give you that focus and guidance, so they do help you. And we think at JRP, we think it's advisable that you set out your emissions boundary, you start developing your inventory so you really know what you're dealing with for your organisation before you sign up to a formal commitment. It just gives you that little bit more breathing space and you're more prepared. I'm going to hand over now to Helen Thomas, who's Managing Director at Western Cider, who's going to explain what it's like coming to this fairly new, but how Westerns as a business are getting on top of this. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Carol. Good morning, everyone. Next slide, please. I'm Helen Thomas, Managing Director of Western Cider. My great-grandfather moved to the Bounds in 1878 and as a young married man started farming here. And as most farmers did then, he made his own cider. As it was so good, he was soon encouraged to buy fruit from his neighbours and make it for them as well. Today, we still have the same farm, but over the years, we have concentrated on growing the cider making side of our business rather than the farming side. We buy all our fruit locally within a 50-mile radius of the factory, and today the business is selling over 50 million litres of cider a year, and exporting to over 40 countries. Next slide, please. We were the first cider makers to achieve BS 5750, a quality management system, which is part of our integrated management system, now 9001. We now have ISO 14001, a certified environmental system, and we have been able to meet our climate change targets over recent years. This last year, we had to complete an ESOS audit, which is the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, which was why we engaged JRP to help us to complete this. Subsequently, net zero has come up on the agenda. It is a huge topic to get on top of, but it's something which we felt that we wanted to achieve, but we needed help to know what to do and how to do it. Next slide, please. We feel we are doing a good job with running a business. We have been doing it for 140 years now, looking at ways to improve and to move the business forward for future generations. Ideally, we need to have a net zero strategy, a sustainable procurement policy, and a sustainability-proofed operations strategy to achieve net zero. Government and major customers are pressing ahead with this agenda, and we need to be proactive with it to ensure we are a great business to deal with. With JRP, we are now mapping out our emissions and our boundaries. Scope 1, our on-site emissions, gas and fuel, burnt on-site, including our own fleet. We do all our own distribution and have a sales team out on the road. Scope 2 emissions, that is the electricity imported to site and solar generated electricity on site. And Scope 3 emissions, our grey fleet and business travel, water supply, wastewater management, and wastewater treatment. The job of work encompasses what we buy and who we sell to. Mapping out all our sources of emissions with the established 3 scopes of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has been worthwhile, as it helps us to prioritise actions. Next slide. Looking back at our figures for last year, you can see the relationship between our Scope 1 emissions in blue, Scope 2 in orange, and the far largest Scope 3 is in yellow. Of Scope 3, the largest proportion is in manufacturing, then transport, then services. Scope 3 supply chain emissions are of critical importance to the business, so this is where we'll be focusing our efforts. Next slide. Coming back to where we started from, our biggest asset is our farm. This has always been important to us, supplying us with apples, added security for the bank, but now it opens up a new agenda, effective carbon sequestration. Our orchards, both standard and bush, grassland, woodland and soils actively sequester carbon. Our objective is to maximise carbon sequestration plus optimal resource efficiency in production and distribution. And our goal is that our annual residual emissions is wiped out by effective carbon sequestration. Next slide, please. This brings us back to our route map. Our ISO 14001 environment management system drives our continuous performance improvement programme. It also provides us with the framework for developing our net zero roadmap. The aspects and impacts register encompasses our emissions boundary, and our developing data inventory underpins data collation, processes and reporting. So this is where we are at this moment in time, and I hope you have found this useful. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. Thank you. I'd now like to pass over to Joe Uhtred, who's Director of Gateway Procurement, Procurement Specialist Consultancy, and he's going to explain to you how to quantify your Scope 3 emissions. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Carol. Can you have the first slide, please? Perfect. So, as you said, I'm Joe Uhtred. I'm one of the co-founders of Gateway Procurement and Axiom, and we set up about 3 or 4 years ago providing sustainable procurement support. We developed our own software to allow companies to calculate, track and monitor their sustainability performance. And as we've all seen, sustainability is becoming more and more a part of the conversation. I think procurement is now being recognized as one of the key functions to tackling Scope 3 in particular, where you spend your money, how you configure your supply chain, all impacts on your Scope 3. So one of the methods that we use is expenditure-based analysis to sort of help you quantify your emissions. It's a fantastic tool, useful tool to bring that focus to show you the sort of size of your Scope 3. And I'll try and explain that to you today. So next slide, please, Carol. So I know you've seen this before. This is the fantastic illustration that me and Carol like from the GHG protocol. And what I'm going to talk about is this Scope 3. So Scope 3 is what GHG call it. I'd call it supply chain or value chain, or your inbound or your outbound, your goods in, your goods out, your upstream, your downstream, all the same thing. And GHG have categorized this into 15 different subcategories. So there is 8 sort of upstream towards your raw material ends, then you've got the 7 downstream towards your consumers. And when you look at sort of all the elements within your Scope 3, we've already seen the iceberg analogy. There's no surprise that many organizations report that 80% of their emissions fall under Scope 3. So, where do you start with something like that? How do you begin to tackle it? Next slide, please. So, calculating your Scope 3 using your spend data. So the EEIO, the Environmentally Extended Input-Output Model. So that's another acronym for you to remember. Essentially, what countries have done is using the GHG emissions from various industry sectors, countries have produced this EEIO database. So in the UK, DEFRA have done this, where they provide you with a quantity of greenhouse gases emitted per pound or per dollar spent within a specific industry. So they're giving you the quantity of GHGs emitted per pound spent. So, using this rather Americanized supply chain here, I'll sort of talk you through how that works. So here we've got Dolly's Diner. It's a fabulous diner. I recommend it. And she likes to have all her burgers made off-site. So fully made, wrapped off-site, so that all she has to do is put them in the microwave. So she can go on the EEIO database, look up the hamburger industry. She can work out how much money she has spent with that provider over the year, and then times the emissions factor by the spend to give her an industry average emissions from that Scope 3 provider. And the EEIO database, it looks at the whole supply chain. So it's calculated the emissions right through. So looking at the tractor, how it was fueled, looking at the feed, looking at the cattle, how much methane have they produced, to the abattoir, right through to producing this hamburger. And then on the other side, you've got everything that goes into making the packaging, the electricity, the oil, the water, to make the plastic, the wrapper, all the way through. So it's quite comprehensive in that sense. So it's cradle to gate. So all that Dolly has to worry about in terms of, Scope 1 and 2 is how many times you sort of put the microwave on. So next slide, please. So how to use it. If you go down the left, this is sort of how you use it in practical terms within your business. So as I say, you take a period of time. So if you're doing your last financial year, get all the spend data per supplier. So you've got your company names, you've got your supplier spend with them across the year. And then what you need to do is assign the industry to that company. So from the company name in the UK, we have SIC codes. So that can identify the industry. Once you have the industry, then you can go on the EEIO database and obtain the emissions factor. So you've got your spend, you've got your emissions factor, you time those two together, and that will give you the total emissions emitted as an average for that industry. So, that's sort of how you obtain the emissions data, and I'll show you later in a table, which might make this a bit clearer. But the next part, which I think is really important, is to categorize those emissions and those suppliers correctly. So first of all, we would use procurement categories, but also you need to do it in the GHG classification for reporting compliance, those 15 that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please, Carol. So this is sort of procurement categories. It doesn't have to be this. The aim really is to categorize it in a language that you understand, that allows you to focus and sort of drill down into the specific areas. So with procurement categories, you have a number of layers. This is just 2 of them. So on the left there, you've got your direct and your indirect. So in procurement terms, direct is what goes into your product. So your raw materials, your ingredients, your on-the-shelf packaging. Indirects is everything else. And this sort of larger pie chart, this is your indirects. So you might look at that and think, operations, there's 13% of my emissions are coming from there. Why is that? You'd then drill down, you'd see, okay, it's like consumables, is it PPE, is it chemicals? And then maybe it's chemicals. And at that stage, you begin to reach out to those providers, try and get actual data from them, not spend data averages. Are they worse than the industry average? Are they better? This sort of categorization allows you to drill down and have those conversations. Can we switch products? Can we change our processes? Can we mix on site? It allows all those conversations. Next slide, please. So these are the GHG Scope 3 sort of subcategories. So there are the 8 upstream towards your raw materials, your 7 downstream towards your consumers. Many of them make sense. Business travel, we know what that is. Some of them are a bit more tricky with upstream leased assets and downstream, but you need to categorize it in these, for compliance purposes. Next slide, please, Carol. So this is sort of, I think, one of the better ways to use the expenditure-based analysis. It's in this sort of hybrid approach. And if we go through that table on the left there, it should help explain what I've been discussing. So if you have your supplier name, you've got your spend data, you can pull that from your purchase ledger. Then you need to work out the industry so that you can identify the emissions factor. Then you need the procurement categories, and there might be multiple layers there for you to be able to drill down and focus in. You need the Scope 3 category for your compliance purposes. Then you've got your emissions, and then you need to say if it's actual emissions data or is it expenditure based, is it EEIO calculated? And if you go by the theory that 80% of your emissions come from 20% of your suppliers, so those ones in yellow, you start there. You talk to them first, and you try and obtain actual data, and you can see sort of over time, if you move left to right, how the idea is that you obtain more and more actual data as you go on. So your Scope 3 emissions data set becomes more and more accurate over time. And I think this should become easier as more people report, as information is more readily available and to hand. But I think there will always be this sort of residual maverick spend, with one-offs or where companies go bust that you're dealing with, where actually obtaining the actual data is quite tricky. So it's good for that too. But you can see how it helps bring focus. It makes it more manageable, allows you to understand sort of full impact of your Scope 3. Could go next slide, please. So with all these models, they have their advantages and their disadvantages. It is fairly straightforward. It's fairly simple in that it's a stepped approach. Time-wise, you have the information available to you, so it saves you time in that sense. It is comprehensive in the terms that no emission sources are excluded. So you're looking right back to cradle to gate, all the emissions throughout. And then the prioritization piece. So it allows you to prioritize your data. You can do your 80-20. It allows you to focus in, and it creates sort of the foundations of an action plan that you can build from. So it's a great starting point. You can go next slide, please, Carol. But with all these things, there are limitations. So you're dealing with averages. So you might have the lowest emitting provider or supply chain within that industry. You could have the worst. It won't show, it won't reflect within this because you're basing it on spend. Again, accuracy, the process-based approach of obtaining actual emissions data from your supply chain is more accurate. It is the better way. But again, this takes time. And if you haven't got the leverage, if you're not a Walmart or a Tesco's or what have you, and you're asking this information from your suppliers, it might not be so forthcoming if you're an SME. So it's useful in that sense too. Tracking can be difficult. Again, you're basing it on spend. So if your supplier, your provider has done some fantastic work, it's not going to show. So this is the importance of moving on to obtaining actual data. And also the EEIO database has limitations in not every country has one. So United Kingdom does, United States do, many others do, but some don't. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, I've raced through that actually. So the environmental extended input-output model, it's a useful tool that helps you establish sort of how large your Scope 3 emissions are. It allows you to bring focus, so you know where to start, gives you that foundation for your action plan to go about tackling your emissions. Using this sort of hybrid model, which I've shown, you can see how that can work, get you started, allow you to focus and improve that sort of accuracy of data as time goes on. And it's just another tool that we can use. So it helps us on a sustainability journey. It's got its advantages, it has its limitations, but nonetheless, it's useful. So I hope you found that of interest. I did rush through that, Carol, but yeah, be welcome to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Joe. And I hope if that's new to a lot of people listening this morning, do find out more about the process. It's incredibly valuable. I'd like to hand over now to Tom Parrott, who's Head of Energy and Sustainability at University of Surrey. And Tom's going to explain how Surrey University have approached their emissions reduction strategy.
Thank you, Carol. So next slide, please. And skip this one. Thank you. So for those uninitiated, and we may even have some University of Surrey alumni in the room, the University of Surrey actually moved from its original position in Battersea in London to Surrey in 1966, and it was established as the university thereafter. Some quick stats for you: contribution of 1.8 billion to the national economy and 1.1 billion in Surrey. We have nearly 17,000 students, of which 6,000 just over are non-UK. It's a very international university. We have 116 companies on our own research park, which is just across the A3 from the university, which we use for our own spin-offs and start-offs companies, as well as other companies focusing on satellite research, sustainable energy and other pertinent subjects. 96% of Surrey undergraduates are in work of further education, and that is one figure that very much leads the sector. We've got strengths in satellite technology and space. We have the largest UK academic space engineering research centre. We are very much at the forefront of generating the next advances in perovskite solar PV solar technology, widely believed to be the replacement of photovoltaic. And in the most recent THE impact rankings, which assess performance against the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we were ranked 61st of over 1,000 universities internationally. Next slide, please. We are today, though, going to focus on one aspect of what's got us to that level, and that is our carbon performance and how we as a university have gone about setting a new carbon target, as we did in 2020, that encompassed both net zero target of 2030 and also a science-based emissions reduction trajectory. And I wanted to speak briefly about the drivers that got us to that point, really. So a little bit of history. In 2020, the old university sector targets had expired. This followed work that was done 10 years previous by the Carbon Trust and the Office for Students. Those have been taken with various degrees of importance by universities, and some had really excelled in pushing the boundary of their carbon targets and exceeded those challenges. We came to this story looking at this when I joined the university in 2019, and by that point it had become quite clear that there had been a step change, and that what we really needed to focus on was net zero, and it really increasing the transparency of our reporting, making a robust science-based target that would stand up to external scrutiny. And that's how we came about the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But at the same time, we recognized that there were significant opportunities for the university in establishing such a target. So there were opportunities arising to finance projects in different ways, to take advantage of purchasing methods that were emerging with corporate power purchase agreements, private wire PPAs that were coming to the fore. ESCO model has been around for a while, but is now being applied in an off-balance sheet sense to on-site renewable generation projects, allowing us to reduce the capex we spend on carbon reduction, but still take a significant portion of the financial benefit. So that was a real driver for us. Aside from that, our reputation is as ever important. 80% of our students, when surveyed, said that good sustainability credentials make a university a more attractive place to study. So we don't believe that it's the only factor in a student choosing where they study, but it is an indicator of quality, and it is something that is going to become increasingly important as we move into the future. We also noticed at that time that, that donors were increasingly asking for evidence of what we were doing in carbon reduction, and that proved to be another factor in us moving forward this agenda. So we had started to develop this plan at the end of 2019 with a view to getting to our exec board in early 2020. Science-based targets were an important part of that, because they allowed us to tie the target to the science behind emissions reduction and what is now a 1.5 degree limit on warming. And when I talk about this, I talk about what is a business's fair share of carbon reduction. You know, you carve the overall emissions of the world up into a pie. What's our, as the University of Surrey's, fair share of that? And that is what, for me, science-based targets allow us to do. They give us an annual budget for reduction that we must meet if we're to contribute what we need to meet that 1.5 degree limit. And we wanted to ensure that those reductions were realistic and they were credible, and that they were based on current and anticipated policy. So this was very much about transparency for us, very much about a clear budget for annual carbon that we would report against transparently in our annual report. It was about having an internationally recognized methodology that was there and available, and is available for any of you watching this today to use on the Science-Based Targets Initiative website. And it could be combined with our net zero carbon plan when we get to 2030 and we want to then offset any residual emissions that remain whilst continuing to reduce emissions thereafter. Next slide, please. So when we created the target, we wanted external verification. And one route of getting that external verification, as mentioned earlier, is to go down the route of having the SBTi verify your target. For education at the moment, that's actually not an option. There are certain sectors that the SBTi, with their limited resource, are very focused on, and that's completely right because they contain large supply chains that they want that learning to pass down into. For us, we don't fit into that. So we wanted that external verification still, so we had an external consultancy collate the information that we send them, work it through the methodology and calculations of the SBT demands, and produce a target and a trajectory for emissions reduction and the associated carbon budget each year for the university thereafter. So the steps in that process were to establish the boundary, first of all. So what are we drawing a boundary around? The university has some subsidiary companies. It has the research park, it has a sports park, as well as its own campuses. We wanted to define the scopes. Initially, we focused on scope 1 and 2, but I'm going to focus on scope 3 a little later on in this presentation. And we wanted to focus on data collection as well, how we drew together that information working with existing stakeholders, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Then the formulation of the SPT working with the consultant, and then the combination of that with our net zero commitment, which has now been, alongside the plan that we presented, has now been signed off by our exec board earlier in 2020, and we are now moving ahead full steam with that. Next slide, please. A little bit about choosing a methodology inside the SPT process. I think, as mentioned earlier, I'm not going to dwell on this because I think Carol's covered this and it's been covered subsequently. There is a sector approach which allows you to incorporate intensity metrics, which may well be relevant to industry and areas of significant business growth. For us, it is absolutely possible that we should be making absolute emissions reductions. So we simply establish the base year, the target year, and those emissions in our baseline, and we move towards reducing those each year without any sort of metric as to, for us, would be how many students are on campus or what the square meterage of space is, or so on and so forth, that might allow us a little more lenience, I think. So for us, an absolute emissions contraction was the way to move forward with this. Next slide. Another choice that you have to make in this process is how you report. And location and market-based factors are something that not everyone may be familiar with. Very much linked to the greenhouse gas protocol definitions. Location-based would be, if you like, if you're working out of the UK, you're a DEFRA-based average grid electricity factor that is used in company reporting quite commonly. Market-based would be the emissions factor that you get from your actual electricity supplier. So we work with SSE. So we have gone to SSE, they have to publish their fuel mix on an annual basis, and that gives us the actual carbon factor that we should be using. So when you see some of the figures I present later, you'll see there's a difference between the location and market-based factor. And if our market-based is higher than the location-based, you could say that our supplier grid electricity mix is more carbon intensive than our location-based DEFRA grid average. And that's something that provides a real driver in the procurement process. A good point on this is, do renewable energy tariffs actually count towards meeting your science-based target? Well, location-based, is difficult, so there'd be no additional benefit because you're having to use the DEFRA average factor, which doesn't reflect how you yourself as an organization are actually buying energy in the supply you go to. Market-based, if you have renewable energy certified or generation of origin certificates, those can be used to count towards this carbon reduction, where there must be some form of approved energy attribute certificates. So market-based, yes, you can count it. Location-based, no, you can't. For the university, we've decided to report on both, so people get an idea of how demand reduction and our procurement choices are affecting this emissions target. Next slide. In terms of data collection, I'll whiz through this a little bit. For us, we have a good data sets for our scope 1 and 2, and we have really good data sets for electricity and natural gas, as many companies now do. This is mainly about working with stakeholders though. This is about drawing together stakeholders, establishing new links to laboratories, to maintenance teams, if you haven't worked closely with them, who hold registers like the F-gas register, which is particularly useful when you're calculating your fugitive emissions, or invoice records for gases delivered to site, refrigerant gases delivered, and various things. Biomass, for us, again, drawing on statutory reporting mechanisms. In the UK, you're reporting against the renewable heat incentive if you have an eligible installation. So invoice records have to be submitted as evidence for that. And you can draw upon that information in order to create that baseline for CO2 as well, as you have a really good handle on that. You can see there the difference between the total and the market-based factors that I mentioned earlier as well. So really important here is establishing those links with the stakeholders, building the processes, as you're going to need to report every year, making sure there's a timeline for reporting every year and clearly communicating that with these stakeholders. Next, please. When we talk about our actual performance as a university, COVID impacted year notwithstanding, we had a target last year to meet around 19,000 tonnes if we're to stay on that 1.5 degree trajectory that is indicated by that orange line. But we actually achieved 7,500 tonnes, as you might expect, because there was a little bit of COVID impact in that. And again, this year will be COVID impacted as well. And we might thereafter see a tightening to that 1.5 degree trajectory. But there are some significant plans in the offing that I shall talk about in just a moment. Next, please. A little bit about Scope 3. As mentioned earlier in this, Scope 3 forms a significant, it is the majority proportion of our total emissions. So there is work for us to do on this. We have gone about this by establishing a new purchasing policy, which combines 3 principles, essentially asking the right questions when we come to procuring new partners, working with existing high-risk suppliers, so that 80-20 rule that was mentioned earlier, that Joe mentioned, in order to discern who we should be working with to achieve the fastest reductions in our Scope 3 emissions, and also providing the necessary knowledge to procuring contract managers in order to be able to ask these questions of their suppliers when they go out to tender. That education piece is really important in this process because there's never been a sharper focus on Scope 3, and we need to make sure that opportunities are not missed. Next, please. This actually is very relevant to the previous presentation, what Joe was saying really about how this Scope 3 is created at the moment. This is very much based on those averages that were talked about. This is based on financial data driven through average reporting factors and arriving at totals for each of these areas. Actually, this is taken from 311 different DEFRA categories that are then summarized, that have spend against them, that are then summarized into this form that you see in front of you. And I think there are elements of this that will be far higher than our actual performance. We know that we have some excellent partners, for example, in ICT, and their work in reducing emissions is not reflected in this. So the next stage for us, as was talked about, is to begin applying those purchasing principles, working with suppliers. We are already contacting Dell and working with them directly, and trying to drive these emissions down and get to a sensible level so that we create that true Scope 3 baseline. This is very much a starting point for us. Next, please. Actually, Carol has covered this expertly, so we can skip this one, I think. Just saying really that Scope 3, if it's more than 40%, then does need to be included as a science-based part of your science-based target, and we're very much working towards that at the moment. Delivering the plan, though, the important part, delivering net zero by 2030. So as I mentioned, we're working on, and we have received the proposals, a very exciting time for the university. We're reviewing them at the moment, proposals that will increase on-site renewable generation to 20%, facilitating a significant decrease in carbon emissions in an on-site research partnership that we hope can be off balance sheet, and we're working on that at the moment. Incredibly exciting project that has the potential to deliver a 5,000 tonne reduction in CO2. We want to establish a series of new corporate power purchase agreements for supply of verifiable renewable energy up to 2030. Again, we think around 5,000 tonnes of CO2 could be delivered in that form. We actually think we could go beyond that. We don't want to put all our eggs in one basket, so we're working with our brokers at the moment to achieve that. And in 2030, we'll invest in only transparent and verifiable offsetting schemes, whilst continuing to reduce emissions thereafter. There is risk of doing that at present. It does tend to be a little bit of a dark art in terms of offsetting, but the university is engaged in research in this subject, which we hope we can build to identifying local opportunities for offsetting that actually deliver social impact benefits as well. And as well, as soon as possible and within the next year, as our policy states, we want to establish that reliable Scope 3 data, working with suppliers to reduce these product-based emissions. Just one point I'll put on this because it's very topical. Work has already begun in some areas of this, and the remote working piece has a significant opportunity to reduce our Scope 3 emissions. We have identified that simply by all staff working 2 days from home per week, we would deliver a 3,500 tonne reduction in CO2 emissions for that scope 3 portion. So not to mention the NOx reductions that we'd also see. So thank you very much for having me here this morning to present this. I hope that's given you an insight into how the university is planning to augment net zero with a science-based target and is using a carbon inventory to effect in meeting that 2030 target. Happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thanks very much, Tom. That's a really comprehensive run through of what the university is doing under your guidance. The final session is just to do a bit of a recap around using your carbon inventory. So it's about establishing all sources of emissions and sinks for carbon removals, and doing this helps with identifying control and ownership of emissions. That's really important, and especially when it comes to leased assets, working relationships with partner organisations, because the whole aim is to also avoid double counting. So you need to think about who's covering emissions for what in joint ventures particularly, and not double count. So it's really understanding, as we've heard, the scope and magnitude of each source of emissions, so that helps you to determine what needs to be prioritised for action, so that you're on a very solid downward trajectory for emissions reduction. Just reminding you about the Pareto principle, this 80-20 rule. It's really important to work out, particularly when it comes to scope 3, what's activities in the value chain are most responsible, the top 20% that's creating 80% of those emissions. Use existing performance improvement structures and processes around your environmental management system or your energy management system, both ideally, to drive performance improvement for on-site operations, scope 1 and 2, and then all scope 3, and particularly with your main suppliers, as we've heard, as Tom was saying, that they're about to start embarking on that as a next phase in their emissions reduction strategy with their suppliers. It's worth mentioning the impacts of COVID, which again Tom touched on at the end of his presentation. The pandemic is leading to permanent changes in working patterns and arrangements. Organisations have already started downsizing because they can see there are real benefits to reducing their scope 1 and 2 emissions by moving to a smaller office, or moving from an older building to newer, more energy efficient premises. So it's important in doing so to re-baseline, adjust the operational boundary and the data inventory accordingly, and think about those insights for helping you to, if you haven't downsized yet, or changed the premises you're operating out of, have a really good set of criteria for doing that, so that you're improving and reducing your emissions footprint. And the same goes for thinking about how employees are getting to work, commuting. If more are working from home, yes, it takes emissions off your scope 1 and 2 reporting line, but a proportion of home workers are going to be using more energy working from home than if they were in the office. So it's important to look at where your employees are working, who's got a lower commute if they're working from home, and that's and what proportion of lower commutes are going to be good for your scope 3 emissions baseline. But where is working from home with a lot of employees using more energy, especially in the winter, going to actually add on to your emissions baseline? So those can be quite complex, and they need some careful thought. Again, scope 3 is really important if it's 40% more than your total carbon footprint. And if you don't get a grip of scope 3, then you are not going to be making sensible business decisions. And if we use the apparel sector as an example, the majority of brands at the moment are most concerned around scopes 1 and 2 for their retail outlets, and and scope 3 in terms of transportation, of getting textiles to garment makeup, and then from garment makeup onto distribution centres and stores. Clearly transportation is important, but if you look at the graph there produced by the Waste Resources Action Programme, WRAP, in 2016, and you look at the impact of transportation, transport to yarn producer, transport to fabric producer, it's virtually it's totally insignificant compared to the extraction and processing of the raw materials and fibres themselves to make the textiles. So your inventory has to address all sources to determine what really matters to your business. Aiming to become part of the circular economy is part and parcel of working with your suppliers. And as we've heard already, the ability to share supply data with you, and importantly to see which of your suppliers have undertaken life cycle assessments for the materials and products they're using is really important. And if they can supply you with almost like the gold standard, the carbon intensity of each product unit of product or service, to give you a much more refined understanding of your scope 3 emissions is the goal that we're all aiming for. And Tom mentioned offsetting and the importance of credible, robust offsetting. I just wanted to say a little bit about insetting as well. Offsetting residual emissions can be really challenging, and you've got to do it credibly, and you've got to pay the right amount of money for it per tonne of carbon to be offset. But if you're looking at insetting, you can work with your suppliers. If you can identify down your supply chain suppliers who are ready to take action that would really reduce emissions, but they don't have the capital investment, but by working together you can help them do that. That's a really, really good thing to do. And the international platform for insetting, it's been set up by manufacturers, big brands, mainly around cosmetics and clothing. And this is full of case studies for how they are working within their supply chain to inset, to add value and reduce scope 3 emissions, because it provides them with long-term security in how they develop and grow the business into the future. It doesn't have to be about land-based regenerative actions with suppliers. It can be about helping suppliers to invest in new equipment or new premises. So do consider that very closely with your suppliers. It's well worth doing. So my final message is to invest in developing a really good emissions inventory and using it to make your organisation more secure and low to zero carbon. So thank you to everybody who's presented today. I think we've had some excellent presentations from our guest speakers, and so we're able to take a few questions now from people before we wrap up. Just see what we've got in the chat box. One from Sarah Blanchard. Do emission factors take different production methods into account? Presumably this is coming from Joe's presentation. There's another one for Joe as well. How is industry managing to exclude double counting? This particular question is coming from Dan, who says, I'm counting the carbon in my supply chain. My supply chain, who also might have a supply chain, is also counting. So is there a lot of double counting going on? Joe, can you just explain how that's avoided?
Yeah, I mean, quite simply, you just got to be clear on what information you're being provided with, you know, what you're asking for. And yeah, but it is a problem, it is an issue. But you just need to be really clear on what you're obtaining. And the same goes for when you're working out your scope 3, making sure that you're not double counting scope 1 and 2 in there when you're looking at your spend data. So yeah, that's sort of my answer to that one.
Thanks very much, Joe. There's another one. Is there an average way of assessing working from home with so many variables as to who's in the home, how's it being heated, who's heating it? I don't know if any of our panelists would like to answer that one. Is that something that you thought about, Surrey, Tom?
Well, there are lots of behavioural research projects going on at Surrey about this, actually, which is quite interesting, because we do get to liaise with the academic community a little bit on this. When talking about sort of the assessment we've done on remote working, we actually completed a Surrey survey last year on staff remote working. We had over 50% of our staff respond to that, and that gave us a really good view of where staff were commuting from, and where the sort of emissions were based, essentially. That's how we created this sort of working from home footprint of purely based on travel. But I think the question is right in that sort of, how do you actually assess the sort of work-based footprint of someone who's now working in their home, and where does that sit, and where is that apportioned? And that's exactly what the research going on. Is that a university scope 3 emissions? Is that a person's individual scope? It probably crosses that border between both of them. So I think there's more work needed in that area. It's very new research, but as the university sort of gets to grips with that, I'm happy to share anything we find with the group in JRP.
That's great. I think that would be really useful to share.
I think what we can do, though, is, we can offer staff working remotely advice on how to reduce their impact while working from home, perhaps advice for those who haven't considered where their energy is coming from previously, and how to reduce emissions associated with the energy they purchase in their home, what a good deal looks like at the time, all of those sorts of things. Perhaps more guidance is needed in order to facilitate a reduction in those emissions as well.
There's just pops up on the chat something about a white paper on emissions from home working. So I think if we all watch that space, there'll be the Lloyd's Register home working calculator as well. So it looks like there is something out there that would be helpful. I think that's probably all we can do for today. Thank you all again, all of our speakers. Thank you so much to all of you for listening today, all of our listeners joining us on the webinar. We'll send the recording to you, and we'll send the responses to questions that were answered online during the presentation. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, and have a great rest of the day and have a good weekend. Thank you.